back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast as we enter the second weekend of June. And David Anderson back to talk some Rutgers football, specifically touching base on the 25 recruiting class after a monster recruiting weekend last week with 10 ultimately commits from the 21 official visitors that included 2 already committed players, and now heading into another important weekend of official visitors. David, thanks so much for being back, and just wanted to start with your initial kind of takeaways in terms of all the commits that this class has right now, and what your thoughts are, where it stands right now.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't say I was worried with the fact that I think they only had 8 commits heading into the weekend, but we're kind of getting to that time of year where players have to decide where they want to go to make sure that they have a spot, especially with the early deadline, the early signing period nowadays. You don't want to be caught with no place to land, especially now that teams are taking smaller classes, which we'll talk more about later. But I mean, I wasn't expecting this many commits. I don't think anyone was. But just overall, it's nice to have that framework in place. And then a big takeaway would just be you can see how momentum works. How when we talked about this stability. And then once you generate a little bit of momentum, these guys start talking to each other. Hey, maybe we can do this together. And then that, the train leaves the station. And then you sometimes have moments like this where so many players commit in such a short period of time. So it comes from being like willing and able and in a position to accept for something like this type of success to happen in a very short period of time. So that's my main takeaway, is that it's clearly a sign that there's a strong foundation in place, good process, good infrastructure. They got a good plan when these guys come to do the official visits, and then it all works together to have this type of result at this stage of the recruiting cycle, which do we think Rutgers is going to stay in the top 10 or top 15? No, like you covered already earlier in the week, based on the average player grade, etc. But really what we've talked about before is you just got to keep yourself in that 30 to 50 range in terms of where your class is. And so, if you're at 12 right now or 11, whatever it is this morning, like that's good enough that you're not going to drop outside the top 50 if this core basically stays in place.
It's obvious that although some of the commits they got, weren't highly rated, they identified them early on in the process, and got people that they thought are really good fits and are, players that can develop into important contributors. But also in terms of that ranking, knocking off a few higher rated players is one way of boosting your ranking. But the other way is also players that might increase their rating along the way that are already committed. Are there any, I guess, in terms of your thoughts of who did commit, and there's a bunch of ways to look at it, player grade, star ranking, offer list. I guess what jumped off the page for you in terms of anyone, in terms of, that had those kind of high marks, or maybe were a little bit underappreciated from recruiting services that you see potential with on film?
I would say the 3 guys, and this kind of goes to a point I've made before about how you have to see certain players at certain positions in person. And for me, the positions that are most important to see in person are cornerback and offensive line, because from a cornerback standpoint, you want to see a guy in a camp setting, or even just physically, like how he looks like next to the guys he might be matching up with, because on film, it's really hard to tell what competition they're going against at the receiver position if you're a corner. And then on the offensive line, it's really hard to tell like how big and strong are the guys that they're actually trying to block. And so the first thing that jumps out at me is, I mean, Clayton, he comes from Warner Robins, Georgia, and I actually interviewed somebody, I think it was a couple of years ago, to apply to my like alumni program, and from Warner Robins. And the biggest takeaway I got was like, it's fairly close to Atlanta. I mean, it's outside of Macon, which is outside of Atlanta. And so most of the recruiting attention is focused in the Atlanta area because it's just so huge. So that's a player in Clayton, Michael Clayton, the cornerback, who I do think his rating will jump for sure. I think that he was only like the high 60s rated player in Georgia. But when you look at him, he at times just has absolutely no technique whatsoever. And so you really got to figure out, like, can he accept coaching? Is he coachable? And just has not reached that yet. But like when you see this guy backpedal, you're like, whoa, this guy has got some amazing closing speed, and just with that raw ability, that's something that usually causes a player after another year, now that with more tension, that he's probably going to jump with his ranking in his senior season. That's one. And then on the offensive line, I definitely like both Chris Vigna from Berg and Catholic, because one of the things that he does that's underappreciated is he will blow his man up, but he's also cognizant that he doesn't want to shove him too far back and then like open a lane for a linebacker or a safety to fill that gap. So like he does a lot of those little things that are not noticeable when you're really like sizing up a prospect, like, oh, how big, how strong, how fast is this guy? So I do like what he brought to the table, but Nakai Wynn, I mean, to me, he looks like a 4-star. I think Richie O'Leary mentioned something similar on their podcast, but when I look at this guy, he just explodes. He has really, really quick feet. Like when you talk about like how quick is it are his feet moving, right? Like a quarterback, you don't want to have happy feet, but when you're a lineman, you want to be consistently adjusting your leverage to ensure that you're getting lower than the other guy. And so when I look at Win, I'm like, man, the fact that he has 12, I think you mentioned he had 12 Power 4 offers, came as no surprise to me, because he just looks like a guy who's going to be ultimately a 4-star at the end of the cycle, probably 6 months or a year from now, whenever they finalize the 2025 rankings. So those are the three guys I would say I feel most confident would probably get a boost in their recruiting ranking. And it, like I said, I think it comes from you have to see them in person at those positions as to why that would be the case.
And wanted to ask you about a position group I thought they did a really good job with that I was high on was wide receiver with Jordan Houston and Vernon Allen. Both have pretty good offer lists as well. Both currently 3 stars, but in terms of uh, player rating, Houston's at an 88 and Allen's at an 87. The class average is right around an 87. But just in terms of what they bring and the versatility and speed, what are your thoughts on their potential?
I mean, I think their rating is accurate for now, but I really like the upside that both guys bring. I mean, I guess I'll start with Houston. Houston is, I would say, top 2 or 3 ceilings of everybody on this list. And what's interesting about it is when you're watching his film, some people are making the Mohamed Sanu comparison, which I think is because it's like it looks like it's very hard to press him. But then if you don't press him, he just kills you on slants. So he kind of looks a little like Taekwon Underwood, and like he's really quick on slants, but then also he can absorb a hit even from a much bigger guy at a high speed and like regain his balance and oftentimes almost use that to his advantage. You see that with running backs a lot, that they kind of can take the contact and then allow them to go in another direction. So I really like what Jordan Houston can do. He also just he kind of shows a little bit of Underwood, a little bit of Carew, a little bit of Sanu. So if he becomes in any of those three, I think we'll be quite happy. So that's where, like, yeah, with wide receivers, it's very easy for them to bust because they really have to be good route runners. They have to study film. They have to do a lot of these things to really be elite. But Houston, like, he does a lot of that. I mean, Allen, what makes him unique to me is just that his first step is ridiculous. I mean, his middle gears are smooth, but it's more that that first step that he has should allow him to get open. And both of these guys are pretty big, so I would feel like they're going to bring something to the table very early on in their careers. And so, I mean, I think that he's also a good yak guy. And with the Kirk Shiraka offense, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to suck defenders into the box, and then your receivers should have extra space. And so we didn't get to see it a lot last year with Winston's inaccuracy, but you have an opportunity to add receivers who can make plays after the catch. And that's really what Allen does for me when I see it. Like, he's not a perfect prospect. Like, he at times he doesn't use his frame to create space, but he really is a guy that, he can get yards after the catch, especially if you get him the ball in space. And he's pretty big and fast. He kind of reminds me a little bit of when Rutgers had Mark Harrison, where I think Mark Harrison ran like a 4.46 at 231 pounds, either at the NFL Combine or maybe it was Rutgers Pro Day. But like that type of guy that is just huge and smooth. And so There's just like very, very high potential. Though again, I don't think he's like super polished, so that's probably why his rating is where it is.
And Rutgers getting a lot of help in terms of prioritizing the defensive line. Can never have enough depth there. They got 5 commitments out of the 10 from last weekend, which included Robbie Johnson, who committed on the Monday. You also have Chase Linton from Georgia, who just got upgraded to a 4-star per 24/7 Sports. Not the composite rankings, but their rankings specifically, as well as Myron Gurman and Raiden Bruins from Florida, and also Braxton Kyle, another Georgia guy. Kind of overall thoughts in terms of how they did there in terms of upgrading the defensive line.
Well, like we've talked about, and I kind of hinted at earlier, like from when we talk about premium positions, it's just so important to have depth at those spots because you need more than just your starters to play, especially on the defensive line, and you don't really know how guys are going to develop. Like the bigger they get, can they maintain that explosiveness?
Mm-hmm.
Now, do I think like in terms of Linton? I mean, this guy is reminds me a lot of player Shiano. Let's say not Shiano 1.0. I would call it more like Shiano 1.5, which is once he got things going, like they were able to get the guys like the George Johnsons, the Joe LaFedge. I've already mentioned Mark Harrison, but like these really really athletic guys, and not all of them are going to pan out, and not all like Joe LaFedge ultimately became an NFL player. Zaire Kitchen probably would have fallen in that same category. He didn't really go to that level, but just because of how physically good that guy was, he was able to contribute on special teams and then eventually become a starter. So when I look at the defensive line, I think all these guys between Allen, Bruins, Johnson, Kyle, and Gurman, who we can talk about him, you might profile elsewhere. But I mean, all of them pretty much bring that to the table. In the case of Johnson, like it just ragdolls people. So I don't know if that's going to translate, but really, and again, this is a very high comparison. But what you see him do at the high school level is what you saw like a Reggie White do at the NFL level. It doesn't even look like he has moves. He just like pushes people and runs around them. So like I don't know, like we don't know how that's going to translate. But if you can't do that at the high school level, you're not going to start doing it at the college level, right? So that's one of the things like I noticed with him. I mean, with Braxton Kyle, he's the reverse. He's huge. He has moves, but he doesn't necessarily have the explosiveness. So can he either refine the weight that he has, or can he just like maybe play at a lower weight and be more successful? But I mean, you can never have too many guys like that. I mean, Bruins, he plays a lot of sports, so you think that he'll be able to in like just specialize a little bit more. The one thing I like about him, he reminds me of Aaron Lewis in a couple ways. One, sometimes he can get a little bit too high because he bends at his waist rather than bending his knees to get good leverage, which is something Aaron Lewis did do at the high school level, would concern me slightly. But I mean, clearly you've seen it's not a problem now. The other thing I like that he does like Aaron Lewis is he when he smells blood, he just explodes. So it's like when he sees that there's like a play to be made, he does it. And then I guess with Linton, I'm not surprised at all that he's like been upgraded because his change of direction is just insane. Like if there's an initial pop and then a ball goes to the side, like he can just adjust his play very quickly, which is not common for someone of that size. Like he moves like a change of direction more like a linebacker. So of all those guys, I really like what all of them can bring to the table. But again, for anyone on the line, you don't know. Are they going to get too big to play end and they have to play tackle when they put on weight? Do they not develop moves that they need to succeed at the next level if they're playing against guys who are as big and strong and fast? But I mean, when I saw just wide receivers and defensive linemen as the main guys that were showing up in this class, I was like very, very, very happy that those were the ones that they got. I mean, really, the theme of this was the premium spots. The raw guys are totally fine, and I think like Johnson and Bruins would be to me really where like very raw potential guys. But when you have a pipeline and you don't need this guy to play, you can develop on their own schedule, and then once they're ready, they can go in and play. Especially if they bring these raw tools to the table, they're going to help on special teams. I mean, really Rutgers has to leverage a lot of safeties and linebackers. But if you have defensive linemen who are big and fast and can run in space and tackle, that's even better, especially on like punt protection, for example, because then they can go down and tackle, but you also feel good about them holding up against like a punt block if the other team's bringing it. And then the other thing is just um, like again, it just reminds me of Shiano guys that he was getting 2008, 2009, because yeah, they're not all going to pan out. But worst case is you got a really strong athletic guy who's playing on the scout team, helping everyone improve. And if just one of three or one and half of these guys pan out on the defensive line, you're going to have a formidable pass rush with four, which is not something that they have now, and something a place they really need to get to.
Yeah, great points there. And just in terms of adding to this class now, they're heading into another big official visitor weekend. Some current commits are visiting, but there's 8 non-committed players that are coming, 6 that have pretty substantial Power 5 offers and Power 5 visits still scheduled for the month of June. 3 on the defensive side, defensive lineman Yvonne Kamaju from Maryland, set to visit Duke and Virginia Tech, already visited Penn State. Defensive end as well, Tayshawn Alston from North Carolina has Carolina and Virginia Tech scheduled, with South Carolina already done. And then also safety Tariq Hayer from St. John's in Washington, D.C. Has Michigan State and Maryland scheduled, with Cincinnati already. So in terms of prioritizing defense, still looking to add to that defensive line. And then 5 offensive linemen visiting that are uncommitted, 3 of which have pretty solid visits scheduled. Connor House from Florida, NC State, Ole Miss, Arkansas. Joshua Blackstone from Maryland has Ohio State scheduled. And then Jaden Breaker, another Georgia player, with NC State, Kentucky, and South Carolina as visits, as well as 2 unranked guys from Florida, Woody Selusian and Garrick Gordon. One from Miami, Gordon's from Ocala, Florida. So looking to, like you said, adding depth pieces, obviously high-end talent as well, but just adding along both sides of the line seemed to be a major priority. I guess, what are your thoughts on that strategy, and also any other kind of needs you see right now with the 25 class?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess talking about defensive line, when you got Kyle, Johnson, Bruins, and Linton, probably those 4 are most likely to play defensive line. But, it's always possible that one of them can end up on offensive line. Maybe even Robbie Johnson, for example. We didn't talk about Myron Gurman, who some sources have him listed as a defensive lineman. I see him more as like a blocking tight end, maybe ultimately an offensive lineman. That's a guy who kind of one of the themes we're seeing is Rutgers being the first ones on these lower recruited areas.
Mhm.
Gurman's from Spencerport, New York. I have a neighbor who's from Buffalo. His last name's actually Spencer. So I'm like, hey, have you ever heard of Spencerport? He had never even heard of it, even though he's from Buffalo, which is fairly close by. So that's the
Wow.
type of guy who likely doesn't have a lot of um, just like awareness about him. So seeing some of these guys come in that are, likely going to get a boost or be more noticeable now that they're the Rutgers offers fine, especially defensive line. You can never really have enough. Do I think they're going to end up taking, let's say, 8 defensive linemen in this class? No. Like, it definitely would be okay with like 6, especially because Shiano does a really good job of convincing defensive linemen that maybe they'd be better served on the offensive side. That can kind of cover up for the fact that maybe you don't have as many offensive linemen. I mean, we've seen like Ireland Brown, he moved from defensive line. Troy Rainey moved back and forth. So I do think they'll take some more defensive linemen. So I wouldn't panic about like there's too many defensive linemen in the group that they might get. And then also like you have to worry about flight risks. Like Johnson and Linton, like obviously their profile has risen very considerably in the recent memory. So I would say if they can secure another defensive lineman or 2, that would make me feel good. But if we went into the season and they only had 4 committed, I wouldn't necessarily think that we're going to have a situation like last year where there are no decommits, especially at a position like defensive line. So that would probably be one. I also am of the mindset you can never have enough cornerbacks. So like I do think it would be nice to land a couple more. one of the things that most of your listeners know is I'm always apprehensive that guys aren't fast enough. I mean, just think about Isaiah Crumpler. I wasn't sure he was fast enough to play receiver, and then we see him running around in the spring game playing corner and completely blew me away. So, not, I mean, I trust the staff, but you always need to have guys with that elite level of speed because nobody's moving out to corner. They're usually moving in, like, closer to the ball rather than vice versa. So that would be the main thing. I mean, they don't need running backs because obviously they have three true freshmen now with the reclassification. They, I doubt they'll add another quarterback. So, I mean, in terms of what you want more, I mean, more offensive linemen and more corners would be mine. And then, sure, if you can get another defensive lineman, that's fine. I think they got enough depth at linebacker with some of the guys that we have, maybe Kaba, maybe Deloach, some of the other guys already committed. So, I mean, in terms of weaknesses, yeah, probably just adding a little bit more beef on the O line, maybe another cornerback would probably be the closest to a weakness, I would say. But at this point, this is very well rounded and really where you want to be as a class, even if signing day was tomorrow. I think I would be more than okay with this being the class.
Yeah, good points there. And two points is one that is always a concern, right? When you have commits that are down south and not necessarily local, a little bit more work for the staff to put in terms of retaining them and keeping things on top of their recruitment. But I do like that they've continued this trend of going into specific regions. Georgia, obviously, really tapping into there. North Carolina continues. Florida continues. Also, the Big Ten footprint. But then also just in terms of how they're not, once again, relying on New Jersey and the tri-state area. They are getting certain recruits from there, but they're not kind of, what's the word? I guess at bay or waiting for certain guys. They're
Right.
identifying some of these underrated guys that they're ready. They're fully willing to go with, rather than just wait around for local kids. So I think that mentality is a welcome change from years past. And then in addition to that, you hinted at it before, but just talking about class size, and how that might change in terms of what other schools are doing, in terms of weighing the transfer portal and versus what Rutgers is. So we don't really know how many spots they do have left, and it's always changing. But I guess what are your kind of thought in terms of how that maybe changes the staff strategy, in terms of how other schools approach the portal versus high school recruiting, and how you think Rutgers is approaching?
Yeah, I mean that's why I think it's really important to get in early on the guys. Again, I keep harping on the term premium position, but like as college moves closer to what the NFL is, you've got to make sure you've got cornerstone players at like defensive end, cornerback, receiver nowadays is premium position. And so I think that by moving in this direction of getting these particular positions early, it'll be easier to find tight ends, linebackers, running back if something happened later in the cycle. Like let's say you find out that Sam Brown's, going to declare early for the NFL and one of the other younger guys is like a career-ending injury and you have to go back to the well and say, "Hey, late maybe we do need a running back, another running back in this class." Right? So in a situation like that, I think that those guys are available later in the cycle. In terms of the overall numbers, yeah, I mean, this same mindset, like what I'm saying is not rocket science. Like one of the programs I'm closest to is because one of my friends is heavily involved with South Carolina Gamecocks, who you mentioned a few visitors going to that, and like they're very cognizant of like they're going to take less guys, they're going to take advantage of the transfer portal. In their case, even at quarterback, which I don't know if Rutgers is really in a position to get an elite quarterback. We saw them get Kelly McManus this past year, but even quarterback teams are less like reliant upon the high school ranks. So you got to just go to the positions that are most important, that are going to be hardest to get in the transfer portal. Offensive lineman, pass rusher, cornerback, especially because pass rusher and cornerback, if those guys are that good, they're going to be leaving for the NFL after 2 years, 3 years anyway. So that's really a key thing. And then I think Rutgers needs to take advantage of the fact that, the Penn States, Ohio States might be taking less kids because if they're going to give you this opportunity, take it, right? Rutgers needs to continue to rely on high school talent more than these other programs because they don't have as much NIL to offer, a big time transfer. They don't have the resources. They don't have, the pedigree yet, and maybe we'll get there, for someone to come in at some of those spots. So I do think they're doing a good job, both in terms of the timeline as well as taking advantage of what other schools are doing and doing some of the same things, but not the exact same things to try to like move their way up the rungs of within the Big Ten and now the Power Four.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, Shiano is not shy about calling Rutgers a developmental program, so it makes sense to especially build depth, like you talked about, at certain priority positions, and use the portal as they're using it to plug certain holes. As you mentioned, NIL is not as at the level that it is at a lot of other Power Four schools. So I think it just they're set up in a way to the way they're recruiting, they're set up developmental wise to support that as well. So I think that also is a selling point for so many high school kids to commit to Rutgers. And right now the class is at 18, as you mentioned. They're right now ranked number 12, player rating right around 87. Just in terms of where they're at right now, we'll see. A lot of those schools, the Blue Bloods, have not gotten those premium recruits yet. There's a lot of highly rated kids that are still undecided, so that will impact rankings. But in terms of Rutgers, hoping to add a few higher rated players as well. I guess any closing thoughts in terms of where the class stands and just kind of what you're looking for, how you're kind of viewing things as we enter the second official visitor weekend of June?
I guess just one of the things you can't lose, and talking about like what other programs are doing. One of my neighbors is a huge Ohio State fan. He just talks about how they don't have like the heart a lot of times that they used to in previous program history at Ohio State, and he feels like Michigan is having that at a higher level at times. And when I look at this particular class, it sounds like they're getting guys who really like football. I mean, you got to take it one step at a time, right? I mean, Shiano, when he first got back, he was like, we just need some fast guys. Like, you get the Chris Longs, Max Meltons types. Like, even if they're a little undersized, like, you have to just get some speed. And it's like, okay, now we can get some big guys, and they have a class with 7 offensive linemen. But when you're doing that, you can't lose the fact that you need these, like, either underdog, chip on your shoulder, Monungai types, or just guys who love football. And for example, I want to talk about Gurman really quick because when I first saw him, his film, I was actually watching his basketball film, and I was like not overly impressed. I kind of thought that a guy of his stature, especially playing in a smaller like school, would be better at basketball. So when I turn on the football film, and basically every single play, if you watch who was the very first person hitting another person on that play, it was him every time. And it was like, sure, partially it's your first step, but it's just because you see that he likes to hit people, and so that's one of the reasons why I think maybe he ends up on the offensive line. But like you need guys with that enthusiasm coming into your program, even if they're not from New Jersey and like bring like Jersey toughness or Jersey pride or whatever, but just like guys who want to hit. And I felt like, Braxton Kyle also similarly is like, even if he has a low rating, the fact that this guy's motor and he's chasing people down 15 yards downfield when he weighs 325 pounds, like that's contagious. And I think people just see it on Saturdays, but you got to remember that the season is a grind. The off season is a grind. I mean, how many times was I lifting on like a Thursday in April and like I just didn't want to be there? But our coaching staff did a good job of making sure we had at least one guy in our lifting group that was that guy, that's like, I'm going to lift like 10 more weights just for fun, even though we've already completed our circuit. And so I think that the staff's doing a good job of getting these high upside guys, but not losing the fact that like you still need like this backbone of your program of the guys who expect to be around for 4 years, probably won't start until their third or fourth year, maybe won't even be in the rotation until their fourth year, but like they're bringing it every day. And I feel like the staff is not losing sight of that, which is something that I think there may be some inefficiency happening at other schools that they're losing that a little bit of that touch, especially as we move into like a more virtual world. I think Rutgers is doing a good job like identifying and having these guys on campus and really interacting with them to know like who's going to bring their lunch pail. And it doesn't have to be every guy, but you need enough guys on your team with that mentality for it to manifest itself throughout the team. So that's one of the main takeaways that I feel good about watching, what the staff is doing to kind of bring people who contribute in all these different aspects and having a well-rounded program.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And I think it just speaks to kind of the experience and maturity of the coaching staff. And also Shiano, just in terms of his building the identity and culture of the program. They know what the players that fit what they want in a way to evaluate that's just not black and white in terms of certain ratings. Obviously, you need to continue to upgrade and increase talent on the roster. Ultimately, you'd like to see this class rank closer,
Right.
in the 20s and closer to an 88 player rating versus an 87. But as you said, if you're missing on those character and kind of intangible parts of their game, that can really be detrimental to the growth of your program. So I think they're supplementing some of that in a positive way, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they can close out this class, and then also how many spots they do potentially leave open for the portal after the coming season. But one last thing I wanted to touch on, and then you could give me your closing thought on that, is just in terms of how important it is and how smart it is of the staff. Last year, we saw they pretty much had the class completely set before the season started. They're obviously approaching that same. They're about to do the same as well for this coming season. Already 18 spots, and closing in on more now. How important do you think that is for a program like Rutgers to go into the season to be able to focus on the then and now, and have maybe a few spots to fill in the portal, but have the core of your class set and stable entering the season?
I mean, I think it's hugely important for, let's say, the non-traditional Power Four teams to have that. And I mean, sure, Rutgers has plenty of football tradition, but they're not like a blue blood level for the Big Ten. And it's super important because let's say you hit a rough patch early in the year. We talk about decommits, right? But let's look at a school like Virginia Tech or Northwestern. Rutgers just ramsacked both those teams early in the year. But then as the season went on, those teams kind of righted the ship. So if you have guys who are not committed, then they may just start looking elsewhere and not circle back to you. If those guys are committed, they've already like made a decision. If you hit a rough patch earlier in the season, something's happening, like yeah, maybe they're starting to think about elsewhere, but if you right the ship, they're still on board. And I feel like what we saw even for Rutgers last year, they started 6-2, they hit a rough patch, but still no one decommitted. So it was definitely a really good situation, and I think it's really important for a school like Rutgers to have that.
David Anderson, a pleasure as always for your insight and exciting things ahead for Rutgers football recruiting. We'll have plenty more to touch on in terms of Rutgers recruiting as well. One last thing before we go: Chloe Timberg winning the national title on Thursday night at the NCAA Outdoor Championships. First track title for the program in over 40 years. First national title for a program since Ashnault and Soriano with wrestling. Any thoughts on that? I don't know if you had a chance to watch it or not, but just I know you followed track and field, her career a little bit. I've talked about it a lot. I actually did say that I felt like she was due a big performance this week, and she came through on the biggest stage and the biggest day of her career.
I mean, I guess I'm a little bit surprised. For anyone who cares, I worked on a bunch of posts for Off Tackle Empire, where I'm also a contributor in my very, very little spare time. So next week is Rutgers Week. And in Rutgers Week, we've got several articles about football, basketball. And when I was doing the Olympic sports roundup, I was taking note that, hey, maybe she's got a shot here. But I am surprised. And just the national recognition you get when any of your athletes wins the national title is great. So congratulations. And, it's just a great step for the track and field program as one of the ones that's trying to elevate itself within the Big Ten. So credit to her, obviously, and the coaching staff for achieving that milestone.
Yeah, huge win for Chloe Timberg. It's going to ring the bells, and great to see some more on that. But thank you so much for all your insight once again, and thanks so much for watching this latest episode of the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I hope you have a great weekend.